Hi, this is Patrice, host of Federal Grants Explained, and before the video for the next episode begins, I'm recording this brief audio to correct some of the language that I used. At the very beginning of the episode, I mentioned that 60 universities' grants were canceled. That's incorrect. 60 universities are on a watch list, and at least one of the universities has had grants canceled. Up till now, almost $3 billion in grants and contracts awarded to Harvard University has been canceled. When I recorded the episode, the total at that time was $2.2 billion in grants and contracts. I also mentioned later in the video the infamous OMB memo that noted all federal grants and other financial assistance would be paused or frozen. Again, the memo described the OMB's direction for federal agencies to temporarily pause all activities related to obligation or disbursement of all federal financial assistance. Basically, still a federal grant pause, and of course, other financial assistance. So those are the two corrections or clarifications I wanted to make before you start watching the video. Thanks so much for watching this and other videos, and a special thanks to those of you who have subscribed. Now on to the episode. Welcome back to another episode of Federal Grants Explained, a new video series I created to explain what's happening in the world of federal grants under the current administration. So let me first acknowledge that it's been over 3 weeks since I released the last video about the 60 universities grants being canceled. I've since written a think piece about it. I've released shorter video updates on that specific issue, and it continues to evolve with Linda McMahon recently, and of course that's the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Education, now saying that Harvard University is no longer eligible for new federal research grants. And the president has also chimed in to say that the university's nonprofit status will be revoked. So the saga continues on that specific issue. This newest episode, however, is a quick rundown of some of the changes happening at federal awarding agencies that impact federal grants, and about the changes that many, not all current federal grantees are experiencing or will be experiencing. As you are likely aware, some federal grantees are being notified that their grant is either canceled or they're having to revamp the previously approved scope of work to remove any, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives or anything related to DEI or what the administration calls misinformation or disinformation. Others are being informed that they must adhere to a capped indirect cost. Others are facing additional scrutiny to, quote, defend the spend. In addition, federal awarding agencies themselves are also experiencing what I call ground shaking changes. These are the changes that I'll cover in this episode of Federal Grants Explained. Also, if you can stick around until the end to hear some of my thoughts on how some of these changes will impact the country, not just grants, in the future. If this is your first time here, my name is Patrice Davis. On this channel, my goal is to shed light on what's happening with federal grant funding under the current administration. That's the funding freeze, agency changes and shutdowns, DOGE's access to various federal payment systems, DOGE being the Department of Government Efficiency. And we're going to spotlight how the federal workforce reduction will impact federal grants, specifically how workforce reduction will impact the pace at which solicitations, also called notices of funding opportunities or NOFOs, the pace at which they're released, and we're already seeing some delays, how the workforce reduction will impact how grants are awarded, and how they'll be monitored by federal officials. I'll also feature guests such as former federal employees and other consultants. If this is a topic you find interesting and valuable, please subscribe so you know when the next video is published. In addition to subscribing, please hit the notification bell and share this video with others within your organization or maybe even within your professional association who you think will find this information helpful. So just a little bit about me. I am a former federal employee and I'm the founder of GrantsWorks Consulting and GrantsWorks Academy. I'm a grant consultant who specializes in federal and other government grants. So I've obtained and managed approximately $300 million in federal grants from over 20 federal and other government agencies for over 18 years. And I've developed and delivered training for clients, for collaborators, and for federal agency. GrantsWorks is a grant consulting firm based in Atlanta, Georgia, that supports our clients as they find, obtain, manage, and comply with federal and other government grants. We help our clients specifically identify, compliance gaps, manage their grants, monitor and modify award budgets. We help them set up their financial management systems, prepare and submit reports, develop required written policies and procedures, become single audit ready, and of course, we train their teams. So just wanted to give you some specifics on how we actually serve our clients. You can learn more about me and about my company GrantsWorks in the details below. I do also want to point out that I will only share information that is widely available online in all of my videos. I try to do my best to double check the information. As a matter of fact, as a federal grant compliance professional, that is, that's a given. You have to double check, triple check, sometimes check for a fourth time. So I always do my best to double check the information. I also want to be clear that what I share is informational only. It is not advisory consulting or management consulting. It's really just a collection of information that I prepare myself manually, not through AI, to actually, bring these episodes to you as often as I can. My goal is weekly, but sometimes I'm not able to achieve that goal. Finally, it's, taken me some time to create this newest episode because I planned on covering another topic altogether, but so much has happened and so much has changed that in a recent internal discussion, the team agreed that a catch up on all or as many of the changes as possible to date would be most beneficial to you, our audience. So we're going to start with level setting. Right? I think it's important to just understand some fundamentals so that we're all on the same page. I want to first start by briefly clarifying some terms. So we'll start with the White House budget request. So the budget request is the White House's outline of its funding levels and funding priorities, but the final appropriations are passed by Congress. We know, many of us know this, not all, but many of us know this. And so here's a chart that outlines how this is supposed to work. As you can see in step number 3, that's the third step there, of this fantastic chart created by the National Priorities Project, the House and the Senate subcommittee set funding for each program through appropriations bills, or the specific subcommittee. In fact, the Constitution states that, quote, no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law. So as described on the congress.gov website, just to further, make the point, this means that the power of the purse must be exercised through the lawmaking process, allowing Congress to craft the terms of appropriations or deny appropriations outright through legislation. So just want to make sure you're clear that a president's budget is that president's budget. It's what they want in terms of funding levels and funding priorities. So just want to make sure you're aware of that. Congress is actually the body that's responsible for appropriations. You're probably also wondering, some of you, what's the difference between this budget process that you're hearing about in the news today? And by the way, I'm recording this on May 8th, 2025, compared to all the news you were hearing just a few months ago about a budget back in March, right? What's the difference? To clarify, in March, there was a continuing resolution or stopgap funding bill that extended federal funding levels through the end of the current federal fiscal year. And that's fiscal year 2025, which ends September 30th. For those of you who don't know, the federal fiscal year is October 1 through September 30th. The current budget we're referencing in this episode, and that you're hearing quite a bit about if you're watching this around, in May 2025, is for fiscal year 2026, which of course would start October 1, 2025 and go through September 30th, 2026. Just wanted to, use that as a level set. Now, we're going to briefly describe an agency action, right? So for example, an agency action, a recent one that was announced, was when it was announced that EPA was going to cancel over 700 grants. So that really did happen recently, about a week or two ago. So that's an agency action. That's an actual, federal agency saying we're going to take so-and-so action, right? And that action is going to take effect immediately or by the date that's actually laid out in that, announced action. So that's something that is, more immediate, depending, of course, on the date that the action is supposed to take effect. So another level setting item I wanted to, just talk about briefly was that we know that the White House budget request for fiscal year 2026 does include quite a number of cuts to multiple programs and also to multiple sub-agency budgets, right? So it's not just the budget that's going to be cut, but there are, of course, going to be some cuts to the sub-agencies themselves. So, for example, National Institutes of Health is a sub-agency of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. There are, of course, going to be increases to some programs as well. So I didn't want to make it seem as if everything was cut. There are quite a few things that are going to be increased. And one of the things I am going to be doing in this episode is also sharing with you, well, if they're cutting so much, what are they actually prioritizing? What are they actually going to increase? I'm going to just share just a few of those as well. So my goal is not just to share all of the, everything that's on the chopping block. My goal is to, again, give you an overview of what's happening in the federal space as it relates to federal grants. In some instances, I'll cite the grant specifically. In some instances, I'll cite a program that's being cut. So we know if the program is being cut, then that more than likely will impact the grants that program funded. If we hear that a sub-agency's budget is being cut, then we know that that will impact a number of things in that sub-agency, staffing, programs, and obviously the grants, and of course, potentially even the federal contracts that particular sub-agency may have actually funded. So let's start with some cuts that are in the current, the president's current budget request, right? So this is the budget request and also in the draft budget that's been released recently. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to start with the Education Department. And I'm going to just run through the list and try my best not to sound like a drone. So, U.S. Department of Education, there are several cuts that will be to the TRIO and Gear Up programs. For those of you who are familiar with these grants, they, well-known grants. So I just want to make sure you guys were aware of that. They also do plan on cutting funds to the Adult Education Department or program. I'm sorry, the Adult Education Program. And there are going to be cuts to the Office for Civil Rights. At the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program is a popular program that many of you may be aware of. It's also called LIHEAP. The acronym is LIHEAP. There will be some cuts to that program as well. I tried not to include the dollar amounts because then, it'll just be a ton of information coming at you. And I'd rather just let you know what programs are slated to be cut. They also do plan on cutting the funding to the Community Services Block Grant. That's, big deal right there. Now, for U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, there are also, as I mentioned, cuts to sub-agency budgets. So the Health Resources and Services Administration, I actually used to work as a subcontractor for a project that was funded by the Health Resources and Services Administration. They plan on cutting that, but that sub-agency's budget by $1.7 billion. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, I used to work at the CDC. They plan on cutting that agency's budget by $3.5 billion. National Institutes of Health getting a big cut. They're cutting that agency's budget by $17.9 billion. This is what's proposed. I do want to go back to mentioning these are proposed cuts. So when I say they're gonna, let me make sure I'm clear that these are proposed cuts, right? Then, of course, there are multiple programs at EPA that are proposed for cuts as well. The Hazardous Substance Superfund. Many of you guys are familiar with Superfund sites. There are proposed cuts to that program. That is, that's a huge program. And so I just want to make sure you guys were aware of that. They do plan on, they have proposed to cut the Office of Research and Development, either the budget or just want to make sure they plan on, reducing funds to the Office of Research and Development at the EPA. And of course, you guys have already heard about, the proposed cuts I think actually what's happened at the U.S. Department of Environmental Justice is a little bit more imminent. So I won't say that it's proposed to be cut, but if I remember correctly, some of the changes in terms of cuts have already happened. So I just want to make sure that you all are aware of that. You can certainly go and check that out and verify that for yourself. There are, of course, also big cuts proposed for the U.S. Department of Energy. So they do plan on cutting $15 billion from what they call the quote Green New Scam, and those are the many programs funded by the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Quick side note, I have wanted to do an episode on that for some time now, but all these other things that are happening that I think are more timely. But I do definitely plan on doing an episode on that, because there were billions and billions and billions and billions of projects funded by grants and contracts and different funding mechanisms from the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. So I'm really curious to find out what's still out there, what's been, canceled, so just want to make sure you're aware of that. I do know that there is a huge investigation by the DOJ, by a few congressional committees, and by agencies about some funding awarded from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. So I may be doing an episode on that as well. So just want to make sure you guys are aware. But a lot is happening in the space, and so keeping up with them and trying to pull together as many facts as possible, and then trying my best to, of course, QA those facts is something that takes some time. But I'm really committed to doing this because, it's great for you all, for the audience to know, but also, of course, this also helps me, sort of ramp up my knowledge about what's happening in the federal grant space as well. And, that's extremely critical, especially since I'm a federal grant consultant. Back to some cuts at the U.S. Department of Energy. There are proposed cuts to the Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Office. They awarded quite a few grants. We actually had a couple of clients that received grants from the EERE. And so, just want to make sure you guys are aware of that. And of course, there are other funding cuts across the federal government sphere. You can find a 46-page summary of the proposed cuts on the White House website, but I'll also link to that document in the video description below. So now we're going to talk about overview of current changes. These are changes that have been announced. These are not proposed changes in a proposed budget. This is changes these are basically agency actions. So we're going to start from the beginning. Some of these are agency actions. Some of these are announcements from the Office of Management and Budget, which is an office within the Executive Office of the President. So we're going to just provide a brief summary for those of you who did not watch the first video I did, I believe back in February, called What's Happening with Federal Grants. So I'm just going to do a quick rundown and then pick back up on some of the current changes. So we're going to start from the beginning in late January 2025 quickly. So you likely remember, for those of you who, were paying attention at the time, you likely remember the now infamous memo sent by the Office of Management and Budget on January 27, 2025 to department and agency heads that they being the Office of Management and Budget, plan to pause agency grants, loans, and other financial assistance effective January 28th, 2025. So by the very next day, they planned on canceling all grants, loans, and other financial assistance effective 5 p.m. the next day. Obviously, that was a huge shock to the system. But they said that they were doing it because they were, quote, moving aggressively to implement the current president's executive order entitled Ending Radical and Wasteful Government DEI Programs and Preferencing, end quote. So as I mentioned before, you probably also remember, again, the unbelievable blowback on to that memo, with the White House having to clarify the memo, then rescind the memo, and then of course legal action by was initiated by outside organizations, and then of course the OMB, Office of Management and Budget, had to rescind the memo. And the memo we're talking about, of course, is OMB memo M2513. So now that you've kind of caught up, I wanted to give you a peek, and this really is just a peek, and it's a list of things that have been happening since then. So many more details I can share. But let's go ahead and start with that. So thousands of grants have been canceled, right? As I mentioned before, if the grant had anything related to DEI and some of the other things that I'll describe later, they have been canceled, and there are other reasons the grants have been canceled. Again, watch the episode that I did on university grants with a lot of, cancellations that have been threatened. Thousands of grants have been modified, however, not necessarily canceled, but they've been modified to reflect the removal of any DEI-related activities, any Justice 40 alignment, anything that the administration considers to be mis or disinformation, any grant that required a community benefits plan, and several other areas that they deem to be unaligned with the current president's priorities. Some federal awarding agencies have restricted officials from communicating certain restrictions to current grantees. NIH comes to mind. Notices of funding opportunity. Those are NOFOs. You heard me mention that earlier. Those are basically the solicitations that the federal government typically releases saying, hey, this program we are, announcing that funding is available for this program. We plan on awarding X number of grants. These are the application requirements. Here's an executive summary. Here are some of the restrictions to consider. Basically it's a solicitation, but the official term is the notice of funding opportunity. But those have been delayed, by multiple weeks. NOFOs that included any of the DEI, Justice 40, mis or disinformation, etc., those have been canceled or the program terminated altogether. There are 197 terms that have been found to be ones that trigger, and these are words, by the way. There are 197 words that have been found to trigger a, quote, deeper review of your federal grant application. And you can actually probably see an article here. And some of those words include terms like advocacy, affirming care, anti-racist, BIPOC, climate science, cultural competence, equity, female even, yes, gender, and indigenous community. Those are just a few of the 197 words. There's also a new defend the spend requirement that's been put in place by the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, where both grant officers, those are the federal officials, and awardees, so those are the grantees, must provide a one-sentence explanation each time they draw down funds. And according to the Kaiser Family Foundation Health News article, the Defend the Spend initiative is making the drawdown process take longer because it requires government officials to manually approve, quote, previously routine payments, end quote, and they are paralyzing grant awards to tens of thousands of organizations. The article goes on to quote 12 people who said that thousands of payments are backed up. I do want to point out that that article was written in mid-April. It is, again, now early May. Things are changing really quickly. So the status of the backup, or, the reported backup, of course, is unknown to me. Thankfully, our clients haven't really experienced, delays to payments. Some of the other things, yes, they've experienced that, but, thankfully not delays at this time. Changes to date at the NSF, the National Science Foundation. So there have been a lot of changes at federal awarding agencies themselves. And this is the section of the episode where I list some of the big changes. I planned on doing an agency by agency update in an upcoming episode. So if you want me to follow up this episode with more in-depth agency-specific episodes coupled with some additional insight from me so that I'm not just listing the changes, I can provide some additional insight. Again, this is all informational. None of it will be management consulting or any kind of advice. Let me know in the comments below and I'll certainly do that. If you want me to start with a particular agency, you can do that as well. Maybe you say, hey, yes, please do agency by agency updates and start with NIH because I want to know what's happening there. But in this episode, we're going to start with the National Science Foundation. These are just summaries of some of the changes. So on April 25th, which is about, a week and a half ago, the National Science Foundation, NSF, announced it would cancel approximately 700 research projects. How many were grant funded or contracts? I don't know at this time, but another batch of grant funded projects, these are actually grant funded projects that I'm going to share now, that funded STEM education were also terminated a week before on the 18th. So far, it's reported that 1,042 federally funded projects across the country have been terminated by the National Science Foundation. So that's an agency action, not obviously anything that's in a proposed budget, right? So these are active, these are things that are terminated, so just terminated. Again, whenever you think of a grant funded project being terminated, and this is something I've shared in previous episodes, just know that in many instances, the grants funded salaries, fringe benefits, graduate student stipends, and other project expenses. So a lot of times we talk about these grant funded projects. A lot of those projects, the majority, of course, funded salaries because it's people that carry out the projects, right? And so in many instances, a portion or all of their salaries, depending on a number of factors, actually were covered by those grants. And so, as I shared in previous episodes, these cancellations have led to layoffs at universities and other organizations, have led to nonprofits being closed, have led to, hiring freezes at universities. So just want to make sure you guys are seeing the bigger picture. According to Education Week, 3 of the canceled STEM programs included: 1, an after-school robotics program for middle school girls in Chicago. 2, an initiative to expand access for students of color and low-income students to higher-level math courses in Milwaukee Public Schools. And 3, a research project to recruit and train more computer science teachers from underrepresented groups in California. So that's pretty interesting. Again, it's small, mid-sized, rural, or minority-serving colleges and universities are losing funding. So we just need to, just want to make sure you guys are aware of that. So these are typically organizations where it's more challenging for them to compete, to get grants in the first place. And unfortunately, at least in this case from NSF, it's those organizations that are seeing their grants canceled. Another headline I saw but couldn't believe until I checked several resources is that NSF has stopped issuing new funding, quote, until further notice. Again, this is being recorded May 8th, 2025. Maybe by the time you watch this, that restriction would have been lifted. To top all of that off, the NSF director himself resigned amid significant cuts to the agency, cuts that would see the agency's budget go from $8.8 billion to $3.9 billion in their 2025 budget. So I want to double check that. By the way, I've also seen a proposed cut from $9 billion to $4.7 billion. That's part of the reason why I'm not putting those numbers out there, because, things could be misreported in certain areas. So I just want to make sure you guys were aware of that. The bottom line is, unfortunately, the NSF director resigned amid significant cuts to the National Science Foundation. So what are some of the potential impacts to some of the cuts I just talked about? So number one, of course, research projects have been halted, and of course, there are related staffing cuts. Scientists, students, and early career researcher jobs are at risk or have been eliminated. Efforts to broaden the country's pipeline, right? This is the thing. Like, you want to broaden and deepen the country's pipeline for future scientists. Those will be minimized. Scientists are developing an exit plan from related jobs. Scientists will take their expertise elsewhere to other countries, and those countries will benefit from their expertise rather than our country benefited from it. So I just want to make sure you guys are aware of that. In fact, here's a picture of France's President Macron inviting U.S. scientists to come on over to France. So just want to make sure you guys are aware of that. By the way, it's been reported that many of the global development professionals that were terminated from the U.S. Agency for International Development, that's USAID, it's reported that many of them are applying for jobs at non-U.S. organizations. And it makes sense, right? That's their expertise. That expertise, the need for that has been minimized in the country. So, of course, they're applying for jobs at non-U.S. organizations. So I'm going to now talk about changes to date at the National Institutes of Health, or NIH. The changes announced by the NIH cover quite a few areas that I'll list now. So there's been a huge cutback in grants of at least 2.3 billion, with most of the shortfalls for study of infectious diseases, heart and lung ailments, and basic research in fundamental biological systems, according to a publication called STAT. This cutback is in addition to the threats to freeze billions of funding of NIH funding to specific universities. Again, remember my last episode on the 60 universities on the administration's watch list. Again, that's the last episode, so you can check that out. One of those universities is Harvard University, which has had $2.2 billion in grants and contracts canceled. And as I mentioned in the last episode, of the $2.2 billion, a large majority of that are to federal grants. Other grants have been outright terminated for their DEI programs or initiatives. There's also been an immediate halt of grants for medical or science research projects that involve foreign labs working in U.S.-led research consortia. That's a recent announcement, I think about just a few days ago. Another big change, which has caused alarm for a lot of organizations, specifically organizations have something called a negotiated indirect cost rate agreement, or a NICRA, is that NIH announced actually several weeks ago that they plan on capping indirect costs to 15%, again, even if the awardee has a NICRA in place. A NICRA is a negotiated indirect cost rate agreement. So an agreement between the grantee and their cognizant agency. So just wanted to make sure you guys were aware of that. I realize I mentioned cognizant agency. That's a, I'll definitely go into that another time. But of course, that cap is being legally challenged. There's also a new subaward identification system that they have announced. And basically, they believe it's been determined that data is consistent across internal systems and public databases. So going forward, new subawards of $30,000 or more will need separate contracts with NIH, so they're easier to vet and monitor. And they are requiring that these sub-projects are structured as, again, independent sub-projects, not subawards. There have been other changes at NIH that I won't go into in this episode, but again, let me know in the comments if you'd like me to do a few agency by agency updates, specifically one for the National Institutes of Health. Now, what about changes to date at other agencies? Quite a few. There are many other changes, but to avoid this episode being much longer than I'd planned, and it's already longer than I'd originally planned, I'll just list a few changes per agency. So let's go ahead and get started with the Education Department. I don't know where to begin with the Education Department. That one is in the news quite a bit because radical changes are being planned for the Education Department. So the Education Department apparently plans to discontinue $1 billion in federal grants for school mental health programs. That was announced, I believe, last week. These grants were part of the 2022 Bipartisan Safer Communities Act that was passed after the aftermath of the school shooting in Uvalde, Texas. Grants that are aligned with DEI are, of course, being terminated. One example is the Teacher and School Leader Grant that 29 school districts across the country used to fill literacy positions, retain effective teachers, address learning gaps, and narrow achievement gaps. The Ready to Learn grant that funds PBS, Public Broadcasting System or Service, PBS, Public Broadcasting Service, their children's shows has been terminated. Again, that's the Ready to Learn grant, and that was a $23 million grant. Now on to the U.S. Department of Justice. A lot of changes for this agency as well. Let's start with the grants that have been cut that, according to Center for American Progress, have been proven successful in preventing gun violence, serving crime victims and survivors, supporting law enforcement, and reducing recidivism. These were grants awarded through the agency's Office of Justice Programs, the agency's largest grant-making arm. So I managed OJP grants for a large organization for a number of years. And these were $24.5 to $26 million grants. That I believe there were 2-year grants, and they funded quite a few initiatives across the country So it's just really, it's interesting to hear that these grants, that quite a few of the grants are going to be cut. I did not see if that specific grant program was cut, but I just want to make sure you guys were aware of that. As of May 5th, just a few days ago, 365 of those grants totaling $811 million have been terminated. Another issue that caused alarm was in early February 2025 with the removal of all grant funding opportunities, or NOFOs, as I mentioned earlier, from the Office of Violence Against Women's website. So again, that's the OVW. Many organizations around the country receive OVW grants, and all of the grant funding opportunities, again, the solicitations were removed for some time. So just to give you an idea, this office awards grants to many domestic violence shelters around the country. So you can imagine the alarm. So I do want to let you know, though, that just yesterday, 5 OVW solicitations or NOFOs were released. So we're very, very happy to see that. So just want to make sure you're aware they disappeared, but now they've come back. So this is sort of something that we're seeing happening as well. So I want to give you guys a heads up on that. As for the U.S. Department of Energy, there has been a proposed 15% cap on indirect costs. That, of course, has been challenged with about a dozen higher education associations and colleges suing the agency. There are quite a few other DOE changes, but I won't get into them now. Again, I'll be happy to do an agency by agency report out. But it would be like a whole episode devoted to that agency. Let me know in the comments if you'd like me to do that. Other agency news include the National Endowment for the Arts. Grants have been rescinded or terminated, including the NEA Literary Grant. And of course, an agency shutdown has been threatened. National Endowment for the Humanities. 1,000 previously awarded grants have been terminated. Again, an agency shutdown has been threatened. So I know that's quite a bit. There are many others. So, but I do want to make sure that you're aware that what I just laid out are actual agency actions. But what I plan on outlining next are the funding levels and program cuts outlined in the president's budget, the current budget. But I think I'll save that for a future episode. I will provide a few highlights though. So just to give you an idea of what has been proposed, I've already shared that at the top of the episode. I'm going to share a few others. So the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, I believe that's what it stands for. There's a proposed plan to cut a quarter of the agency's budget. Specifically, some of the language noted that they plan on cutting climate research grants that they believe consistently, quote, consistently funded efforts to radicalize students against markets and spread environmental alarmism. All right. Labor Department, there are proposed plans to eliminate the Job Corps because it's seen as a failed experiment. HUD is going to be seeing quite a few, pretty large cuts. $33 billion has been cut or proposed to be cut from affordable housing programs that reduce homelessness and other programs that fund community development projects. So want to give you guys a heads up on that. State Department, their proposed cuts to, $26.5 billion. There are, of course, proposed cuts to cut the CDC by half. Closing the CDC Center for Chronic Disease Prevention. When I worked at the CDC, that was like one of the centers that was quite active, did, just some amazing projects. Some of the nation's top scientists in chronic disease worked at the Center for Chronic Disease Prevention. There are also there's a proposal also to close the National Center for Injury Prevention and Control, also known as NCIPC. And that's the agency that, studies and funds programs to curb gun violence, drug overdoses. And that one really shocked me considering the, huge focus on opioid addiction and fentanyl addiction and problems in the country. But there again are proposed proposal to close NCIPC. Another thing to notice about NCIPC is that 80% of their funding actually goes to states, to cities, and to nonprofit organizations. So those three entities may have some cuts as well. I mean, when they say they're going to close them, maybe they'll be folded into another center at the CDC, maybe folded into another sub-agency at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. I don't have those details right now. But with all the cuts, you're probably wondering what is being prioritized. Like what are they keeping, right? What are they keeping, or what are they prioritizing for new funding? So according to several sources, the scientific research and programs that the administration wants to prioritize, I'm talking, of course, the current administration, include funding for AI and quantum computing research projects about critical minerals. They want to prioritize emergency shelters and deprioritize permanent supportive housing. My very first government grant management role was for a housing organization. And I remember, halfway through my time there, there was a big push to prioritize permanent supportive housing, because the idea is if you provide permanent housing to folks and provided supported services, they're more likely to stay housed longer. Number one, because the agency is actually funding a portion of their rent. And then, of course, the supportive programs, those supportive programs, right, could include things such as funding childcare costs or a portion of childcare costs for, formerly homeless moms, so that they can actually go out and look for jobs, or maybe other supports. But I just want to make sure you guys, understood what I meant by permanent supportive housing, as opposed to emergency shelters. Emergency shelters will house people quickly, but just want to make sure you guys were aware of that, why permanent supportive housing had been prioritized for, I'm sure, at least 10, 12 years. And they also want to fund, they plan on increasing funds at the Federal Aviation Administration. A lot of the increase, of course, is to address the national shortage of air traffic controllers and to upgrade a lot of the air traffic systems around the country. They also want to prioritize supercomputing initiatives and projects. At the Department of Justice specifically, they want to restore law and order to Americans' communities and support law enforcement. So expect some funding that's centered on that. And one thing I saw that I really, I found encouraging is that they do want to continue apprenticeships. I do remember under the Biden administration, that was huge, a huge initiative. There was even a website called apprenticeship.gov. I don't know if that's still there, but the Biden administration really was trying to fund and did fund quite a few apprenticeship programs through, I believe, both the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, again, the bipartisan infrastructure law, and also potentially through the Inflation Reduction Act. So there was quite a bit of a focus on apprenticeships, and then programs that funded apprenticeships programs. I don't know if build.gov is still up. It may not be, considering it's under the previous administration, but build.gov is or was a website that listed every single funding opportunity that was going to be awarded from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So again, bipartisan infrastructure law. But yes, they do plan on continuing apprenticeships. Again, saw a rebirth under the Biden administration, but per the current proposed president's budget, the administration plans to fund something called Make America Skilled Again grants, and they plan on awarding those grants to states, so the states can then administer and award funds for apprenticeship programs. So just want to make sure you guys were aware of that. So I really laid out quite a few changes that some of you may find dispiriting, while others of you may fully support. For those of you who want to know what you can do, though, if your grant has been terminated, I do have some general recommendations. Again, these are general recommendations. We do not provide advice. We do not provide advisory consulting or management consulting in these videos. But some general recommendations is, number one, you can, of course, appeal the decision. This is a bit complex, but legal actions have and are being filed, noting that the reason provided provided for termination were either vague or arbitrary, or they may have violated the Administrative Procedures Act. So just want to make sure you guys are aware of that. Another thing that you could do is, of course, advocate. There's always advocacy. So that means outreach to your congressional representatives. I've seen that be very successful in getting grants that have been unfrozen. Many organizations are indeed making trips to their representatives in DC. So advocacy is something that a lot of organizations are undertaking right now. Some organizations have even created easy to complete forms on their website that allows the public to describe the impact of existing cuts announced by the awarding agency or proposed cuts that are outlined in the president's budget. So just want to make sure you're aware of that. And then diversify funding sources. That goes without saying. So that means that, seeking private grants from private foundations, individual donations, corporate donations, sponsorships. So then, of course, there are local and state government grants. However, many of them are federally sourced. So just want to make sure you're aware of that. Depending on when you watch this, some of the funding that are going to be, sent directly to states as a result of some of the reconfiguration that's happening at the federal level, just want to make sure you're aware that a lot of that funding now will go to states. And so, that, of course, is a route to diversifying your funding. So instead of the funding coming from the federal government, again, they're coming from state or local government agencies. One recommendation I saw that was interesting specifically for researchers was to go public with the outcomes of your research to date. And that was a recommendation on the Michigan Daily, which is a University of Michigan publication. There are reasons why they recommend that, but I just want to make sure that you heard that as well. Some organizations are self-editing their public-facing websites. I'm not suggesting you do that, but some are. There's also litigation. Again, certainly not recommending that. Just making sure you're aware of that as an option. Of course, you can also potentially use the grant that's been terminated to cover closeout costs. And there are ways to go about doing that. If you want to learn a little bit more about how to do that, you can certainly reach out to GrantsWorks. We, again, specialize in federal grants, federal grant compliance, federal grant regulations, and more importantly, how all of that is, applicable to your specific organization. And so that's where we really shine. It's not just, reciting the regs, but how do those regs impact your specific organization based on what we know about several things that we analyze when we start working with you. So as usual, this is a longer episode than I'd planned, but I try to provide as a complete a picture as possible. I hope I was able to help you, get a better idea of the grant cancellations using an agency by agency approach. I described grant terminations announced by several agencies, but again, there are, over 39 grant making agencies. So I haven't really scratched the surface. But what I've described so far probably helps you see that federal funding for the, different types of programs will or have been cut or eliminated altogether. Some of the programs that have been cut or eliminated fund things such as wraparound services for abused youth, survivors of domestic violence, violence prevention programs, certain housing initiatives, alternative energy projects, critical research such as research on Alzheimer's disease, and so much more. So again, wanted to, provide a little bit more context. So finally, I did mention at the top of the episode that I would share my take, and these are just my opinions. They do not represent the opinions of GrantsWorks Consulting, or these are my own opinions. Of course, I'm the CEO, so I've, of course, given some thought to, sharing my opinions. Obviously, as the owner of a business, my opinion as a CEO are my own, and, I, keep those to myself, right? But here's what I do think is going to happen. I believe that medical and scientific research, as I mentioned earlier, for those areas that have been cut, will shift to the European Union, to Asia, and potentially to certain countries in Africa. Yes, I do believe that school choice expansion may negatively impact public schools. So just wanted to make sure you're aware of that. Not just school choice expansion, but some of the other changes that are happening. The STEM career pipeline will be negatively impacted and certainly less diverse, which is interesting because that was something that the country has been trying to do for a long time, diversify, the number of people that were pursuing STEM careers. So, just want to make sure you're aware of that. But, I'll leave my my thoughts about it at there. But one area I realized I did not cover is federal funding to state and local governments. I'm just curious to find out where things are with that. I'm aware of some specific scenarios, but I do hope to cover that a little bit with a little bit more depth in another episode. So that's the end of this episode of Federal Grants Explained. Again, I hope you found this video valuable. And if you did, I'm asking you to do 3 things, just 3. Number 1, press the like button. Number 2, subscribe, and our subscribers are growing. So I want to thank all of you who've already subscribed, and I ask you to please share this video with, your colleagues or association members that you think would be interested in this content. So yes, and that's the 3rd thing, share it as far and wide as possible. Again, if there's a particular topic you'd like me to cover or something you'd like to add that I didn't cover or even something I misreported, please drop that in the comments. Also, check out the links in the description below to learn about GrantsWorks and GrantsWorks Academy, including the Federal Grant Funding and Management Training Series. As a reminder, this training helps you better understand federal grants, how they're awarded, about some of the systems used by federal grantees, and about grantees' audit, reporting, record retention, monitoring, and budgetary responsibilities. So we do cover quite a bit with the training series. It's a 3-module training series. I do want to remind you that that training series is modeled on a program we developed for a federal agency that has been consistently rated 4.5 to 4.7 out of 5 stars by hundreds of participants in that training. I also linked to some of the resources and articles I used to prepare for this episode. So of course you can check them out for yourself. So I know, again, this was a, pretty detailed rundown of some of the changes that are happening. I'm hoping that you found this helpful and it shed some light on some of the things that are happening in the federal grant space. Of course, that is the intention of this channel. Again, I'm Patrice Davis. Thanks for watching this episode of Federal Grants Explained. Until the next video, goodbye.